Everyone, I'm Nicole Banks. I'm one of the Associate Deans of Students in the Dean of Students office, and so happy to get to work with the MFamily program. Thank you all for joining us. I'll pass it off to Michael.
Good evening. Michael Zabriskie, Associate Director in Michigan Housing. I'll pass it on to Mark.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Mark Simmons, and I'm also in the Dean of Students office. I oversee our Beyond the Diag program, and I will pass it to Travis.
Good evening, everyone. I am Travis Martin. I serve as one of the other Associate Deans of Students in the Dean of Students office and also the Director of Fraternity and Sorority Life. So I'm so excited to be with you all this evening.
That leaves Emma.
Hi, I am Emma. I am a graduate student assistant for the MFamily program in the Dean of Students office.
Thank you so much. So I am going to start a slideshow and share my screen. Bear with me for just one moment. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Okay. Let's go through. So I've introduced our guest speakers, Michael, Travis, and Mark, and our hosts, myself, Nicole, and Emma. And this conversation is intended to provide an overview of student housing options, discuss factors to be mindful of when you are talking with your student or your family about making these decisions, and then of course allowing you to ask questions of staff as we go along. Again, please use the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Michigan Housing. My name is Michael Zabriskie. We welcome students to participate in our returning resident process, which begins in January. Space for returning students has historically been somewhat limited, but we expect approximately 25 to 30% of current residents will be able to return for another year, given we are opening a new residential option for fall 26, which I will talk about in just a moment. In order to participate and look for rooms, students must apply for housing via our returning housing process to be eligible to participate in the room selection portion later. There's no commitment by applying, so we encourage students to complete this step even if they don't know what they wish to do. More information will be sent to your student and will be on our website in December. Okay, Rachel, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so here's a sneak peek for parents who are wondering what some of the key dates are. My college student doesn't always share things with me, so this is a chance for you to get the information before they do. The major milestones are applying to be part of the process, which is in January, and then selecting a room the first week of February. Students will receive emails to their UMich accounts notifying them of upcoming deadlines, so please encourage them to read emails from housing@umich.edu. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. I mentioned that some new housing will be coming online for fall 26. This is what you're seeing ahead of you is the Central Campus Residential Complex, or CCRD for short. This will be the future home for approximately 2,300 first-year and returning students across 5 residence halls on Central Campus. For those of you who are familiar with campus, this is located close to the athletic campus and is the closest Michigan Housing residence hall to the big house. Translated into walking time, I am told it is a 15-minute walk to the Diag and a 5-minute walk to the Michigan Stadium. We expect a portion of CCRD will be available for returning students, as well as a larger selection of North Campus spaces. Thank you.
Hi, folks. So I'm going to speak with you a little bit about Beyond the Diag, which is the university's off-campus housing and support program. And I'll give you a bit of an overview of the program and also where it can be most helpful in terms of the off-campus housing options for you. So the program was established about 14 years ago. It is a part of the Dean of Students Office. It's a program that is located within the Dean of Students Office, and it provides resources, communication, education, and support for students who are living off campus right now or planning to live off campus at some point in the future. We provide a whole range of different supports and engagement opportunities and connection points for students, including programming, housing fairs, and other opportunities, both in person and virtual events. Next slide, please. There's two listing services, there's two websites that are valuable to be aware of. The first one is the housing listing website, sometimes called the housing search website, and that is offcampushousing.umich.edu. You can see that listed there in the top link. There's another website below that, and that highlights the cooperative housing options available in the city. We have lots of different types of housing available in the city, but cooperative housing is one option that is sometimes valuable and useful for students who are interested in a co-op environment. So some things to keep in mind when you're looking for off-campus housing, when your student is looking for off-campus housing. We really encourage you to be aware of the terms of a lease, and our student legal services team are licensed, fully trained attorneys with specific expertise in housing law. They are happy to review your lease with you. They would really prefer to do that ideally before you sign it. But they can go over the lease, highlight any terms, any conditions, any strange clauses that might be in there, and really make sure that the person signing it understands what it is they're signing. We want you to think about your rights and your responsibilities. Those are obviously really important. We want you to think about, as part of planning where you're going to live, thinking about things like transportation options, how you're going to travel to and from campus and or any other locations in the city where you're going to be spending time. Thinking about your roommate. Does their approach to study match yours? What about cleaning and chores and paying bills and having guests over? All of those things are really helpful conversations to have when identifying who would be a good roommate, and can lead to challenges if you don't have those conversations ahead of time. We can be helpful when it comes to navigating conflict. We always prefer to avoid it to begin with, but we know that conflicts can come up in a housing situation, and we can be helpful in navigating through that, both conflicts with roommates and also conflicts that come up between landlords, neighbors, etc. We do also want you to think about budgeting, and I know there'll be some content in just a little while related to financial planning, but budgeting is important because we want to make sure that wherever you live is somewhere that feels affordable and manageable for you. So one of the key things that I really want you to take away is thinking about this in terms of the difference between searching and signing. One of the questions I get asked regularly is, when should I find housing for next year? And I suggest taking the time during this fall semester to search, to gather your information, to really think about those things that I mentioned in terms of location and roommates and budgets and the type of housing and your preferences and all those kind of important things. Gather that information, do your research, and then after the winter break, once we get into January and beyond, that's a great time to begin thinking about actually signing a lease. But searching does not mean that you need to sign. So if you hear nothing else about off-campus housing, think about that difference between searching and signing. Next slide, please. These are some things that we want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about leases, when you're thinking about finding housing off campus. There are different lengths and types of lease. Think about how long you need housing off campus. Many leases are 12 months. That's often longer than someone might want and need. But if you sign the lease, you're committed to that legal contract. Please think about making sure that you have renters insurance, because For most landlords, their property, their building is insured. If there's a problem with the building, they will be insured, but your stuff in the building is not insured. So if there's a problem with the building, like a flood or something like that, the landlord will be able to repair their roof. They won't necessarily be able to repair or replace your laptop. Be aware of city ordinances. These are not managed by the university, but they affect off-campus housing, and being aware of those is really important. There are a number of ordinances that were passed by the city in recent years that affect tenant rights and tenant responsibilities where it comes to finding housing and signing leases. Next slide. We do have some information contained within our Take Time Before You Sign campaign. I won't spend too long talking about it today, but it is a great campaign that contains a lot of really valuable information about all the different pieces and parts of the housing search and lease signing process. I believe there are 7 videos. Each video is about a minute and a half long. So you could watch all 7 videos back to back in less than 10 minutes. But they'll give you some really good content to keep in mind as you're going through that housing search process.
Good evening again. So I want to talk briefly about fraternity and sorority life, which is an option for students who choose to affiliate with one of our 56 fraternities and sororities that are recognized by the University of Michigan. And so our 56 organizations are divided within 4 councils. And the picture you're looking at is actually the home of Fraternity and Sorority Life, which is the building which is at 1443 Washtenaw Avenue. And we are a university building that is in the midst of the neighborhood and fraternity and sorority properties, which are all privately owned fraternity and sorority houses managed by either a local or national house corporation. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the housing options shortly, but I do want to spend a little bit of time giving a brief overview of our community. And so the 4 councils, as I mentioned earlier, consist of the Interfraternity Council, which is a local governing body that serves the affiliated fraternities within its councils. The first fraternity in this council was established on campus in 1845. And the IFC really strives to embody the highest level of leadership, scholarship, and service, and it prides itself on really being a supportive environment for students. And then our second council, the Multicultural Greek Council, was founded in 2002. Many of the fraternities and sororities that are within this council were chartered at Michigan in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2000s prior to the council formation. And the council celebrates and promotes multiculturalism through programmatic things and services housed in several racial, ethnic, and cultural communities. And then the National Panhellenic Council was chartered at the University of Michigan in 2005. And these are fraternities and sororities that are historically African-American fraternity and sororities. And they are organizations that were founded during a time when Black students were prohibited, of course, to join some of the other fraternities and sororities, but now are established at the University of Michigan, continues today. And then lastly, our Panhellenic Association was established at Michigan in the first decade of the 20th century, right? So many of these organizations were founded in the late 1800s as well, early 1900s. And these organizations are really great opportunities for friendship, personal development, academic success, and community service and educational growth. And it is our largest council, so about 3,000 students, over 3,000 students are affiliated with this council in particular. I want to spend some time from a housing perspective talking a little bit more about the Panhellenic Association and Interfraternity Council experience for its members. Many of, just about all of the organizations within these 2 councils do operate recognized chapter housing facilities. And so these facilities, again, are privately owned, but they are recognized by the university, and we partner very closely with their either local alumni or national housing board to provide a housing experience for those students who are affiliated with the council. And so some of the benefits of living in a fraternity or sorority house is that they do offer very competitive rental rates. And a lot of times, and sometimes, they are less than the surrounding area. And so in the surrounding Ann Arbor and Washington County area, they do often provide 8-month leases, which is not typical for the surrounding areas. And then specifically with the Panhellenic chapters, all have a live-in house director, which is an adult who is living in the building. And in our IFC chapters, many of them may have a live-in advisor, which oftentimes look like a graduate student who's a little bit older, who provides kind of advice and guidance to the members who are living in. Amenities do vary amongst the different organizations. So as your student is exploring opportunities to join, inquiring about those amenities, some of those might be a on-site chef, some of them might be catered meals, or exercise room study spaces. Many of them do vary based on the individual organizations. And so, next slide here. The picture you're looking at here is actually a photo of the exterior of one of our sorority houses. And I want to spend some time talking about membership in a fraternity or sorority and its housing obligations associated with that membership. And so many of our organizations, if your student chooses to join, may have an obligation for your members to live or support the housing aspect of the fraternity sorority experience. And although the fraternity or sorority housing aspect is just one small aspect of the overall fraternity or sorority experience, many of them do provide some opportunities or obligations for its members to either support the house by either living in or maybe paying a parlor fee as a part of membership to support kind of the operation of the facility. And so for the Panhellenic sororities, they do require that the chapter facilities are full each year. And so what that often looks like is once a student joins, each of the organization may have mechanisms and ways they choose and select their members to live in. That could be based on responsibilities such as your officer roles or you're in your first year of membership, et cetera. And they do set their own processes by which who gets to live in. And so the IFC fraternities typically want to make sure they also have enough residents to operate the building successfully. And so some of them might choose to either fill their facilities to the occupancy capacity, or they may make decisions independently to have maybe certain rooms that are singles, et cetera. So it really do vary in terms of how they operate the assignments of the housing based on the organization. And we can certainly be helpful in facilitating conversations if there's more nuanced questions around how selections are made, et cetera. So if a student is planning to join a fraternity or sorority, either in the winter or if they may have already joined this fall, as has been said earlier by my colleague Mark, is that we do encourage you to take time before you sign a lease because of that obligation, right? So many of the fraternity and sororities may have that housing obligation. We would hate for a student to sign a lease prematurely off campus while they're also joining a sorority or fraternity and then have that obligation as well to live in the house. And so if a student end up not living in a chapter house, either because there's not enough space for every member to live in, or if they choose to go through the recruitment process and maybe choose not to affiliate, as been shared earlier, there are plenty of opportunities and options available for students. And our colleagues here from housing and or the Beyond the Diag program can potentially be of help for students should they go through the recruitment process in January or may have already joined the organization now and then decide, maybe early next semester that they won't live or won't be affiliated with the fraternity sorority. So we can provide that support for students as they're going through and making decisions about their choice to join a sorority and fraternity. So, yeah, that's it for me.
Ugh, having some technical difficulties here. Thank you, Travis. So I'm going to preface this by saying that I do not work in the Office of Financial Aid. I work in the Dean of Students office. However, our colleague from Financial Aid who was supposed to present tonight had an emergency, so I am going to fill in for her as best I can. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to answer them as best we can. I have seen a couple of questions come in about the slides. We will have the slides available after the webinar. We will email you the answers to the questions that are asked and the slides. And then, of course, we will record the conversation, and that will be available on our YouTube channel. And with that, I'd like to speak to you a little bit about the Office of Financial Aid, Education and Engagement. So, of course, there is the Office of Financial Aid where your student can go to find out information about their aid, to ask questions, to meet with a financial aid advisor. There's also this program through OFA that is specific to education and engagement for students. It was launched in the fall of 2024, and it's a 2-year pilot program. What that means is that depending on how many students take advantage of this program, it may or may not continue the way it looks right now. However, the Office of Financial Aid will still exist, and your student can go to financial aid, call, or email anytime. The difference with this program is that students can meet one-on-one with someone specific to financial aid who can talk to them more about budgeting, will help them collaborate with campus partners. And there are actually some courses that your student can take about financial education, and we'll go into those a little bit more. So when we're talking about financial education and engagement, we've talked about on-campus housing and off-campus housing. One of the goals of the financial education and engagement program is to foster independence and responsibility. So to get your student thinking about not only what their financial aid package looks like, but the implications that it has for them and their family. Prioritizing payments, developing budgets, discipline, and then navigating those financial contracts and obligations. As Mark and Travis and Michael spoke to, the cost of living on campus may be similar to the cost of living off campus. Financial aid will work with your student, whether they live on campus or off campus. However, budgeting and making sure that they know whether their lease is a 12-month lease or an 8-month lease, or whether that's a fraternity or sorority house or an off-campus apartment or a co-op, those are all important factors to consider. And so these OFA classes on engagement and education speak specifically to some of those budgeting and education pieces that students are just learning to navigate on their own. So financial aid refunds are usually released after tuition and university fees are paid. So that's usually the week before classes begin. One important thing to note is that a lot of students who sign an August to August lease will have a first rent payment due August 1st. But if you look at what what is up here on the slide, that means that refunds don't come out until maybe the end of August or September. And so students are still responsible for paying that rent on August 1st, even if their refunds aren't paid back to them yet. So when you're looking at budgeting and planning for the semester or for the year, it's important for students to know precisely when their rent payments are due, what their budget is, when they get their refund, because even if that first rent payment falls before they get their refund, they still have to make that rental payment. So that's something really important to know. Aid is dispersed twice in the year. So in the beginning of the fall semester, which is in August, and then in the beginning of the winter semester, which is January. And then speaking of, the first payment being due the first of the month, if your student lives off campus, it's important for them and or you to consider temporary savings to cover payment gaps. So if a student is coming home for winter break and would typically be working in Ann Arbor or working on campus during that time to help cover the rent, but they're going to be home or away from campus during that time, they still have to pay that rent in December. So it's a good idea to talk to them about budgeting and saving up for some times when they may not think about the gaps that they may have in making those payments. The financial education program helps students discuss credit and co-signing requirements. So some leases require a co-signer and some don't. So some students can sign a lease without a co-signer. It talks about savings and upfront costs. So oftentimes deposits for off-campus housing may be a month or a month and a half's worth of rent before that first rent payment. So it doesn't just mean that you have your rent for the 12 months, but there may also be a security deposit, or if your student has a pet fee, something like that. This program helps map out monthly and semester-long budgets so students have a good idea of what they are going to be spending. And then it helps them gather their info. So their ID, their bank information, their credit information, if they need that for their off-campus housing arrangements. And then, of course, you can contact U of M's Financial Education with any questions. The email is right here. It's financial.education@umich.edu. And then budgeting, it's more than just rent. So working in the Dean of Students office, we work with a lot of students every day who say, I have this need for emergency funding or emergency expenses. I had no idea that this was going to happen, and now I'm short. And so we work with students to budget, taking into account water, utilities, internet, phone, gas, parking, transportation to and from the university, groceries, renter's insurance, household supplies, and then one-time furnishings. All of these expenses add up, and a lot of times students may count their rent in their budget, but may not include some of these other costs, especially if this is something that's new to them. So we make sure that we explain and prepare them for these other costs and other monthly expenses as well. So when we're talking about financial aid and appeals, students have a federal calculated cost of attendance that includes living expenses. And so if a student's costs exceed their allotted amount, let's say that they have chosen an apartment or a home, or to live somewhere that's more expensive than what they're allotted or what their refund will cover, students can submit a special circumstance appeal. And that would be in cases where there is higher rent, like I mentioned, if they have medical bills that are unpaid, things like that. It's really important to know that a special circumstance appeal does not mean that a student would receive additional aid that wouldn't need to be paid back. What that means is that if their expenses exceed their cost of attendance, it may open up additional loan options for the students. So please note that filing an appeal does not mean that they would receive additional grant money, but it is likely that that would open up additional loan options for the student. Because it is a federally calculated cost of attendance, there's very little wiggle room in the amount of actual financial aid that they can receive that would not have to be repaid. And again, if you Google financial aid and UMich, you'll come to the financial aid homepage. And you can, of course, look at all of their offerings on their website. I mentioned that there's a course or two in financial aid education, and Heather, who created these slides, actually teaches this course. If you have questions, you can email financial.education@umich.edu. You can also scan this QR code to learn more about these courses. But these are 4-credit courses that students can take to learn more about being financially savvy from the start, being a financially savvy student, or planning to be financially savvy for the future. And these are undergraduate classes that, again, count for credit. If you or your student are interested in making an appointment with Heather, again, Heather focuses specifically on engagement and education. You can scan this QR code on your left. This QR code will take you to a website that will help book an appointment with Heather. Again, your student can also go to the Office of Financial Aid at any time during the week to meet with a financial aid advisor. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the financial education course and program is a temporarily funded program. So if this is something that you or your student really value, please let Heather know by scanning the QR code to your right and letting them know about your experience with this opportunity so that we can continue to fund it if that's something that you have found valuable. This is just a reminder slide. So when you are talking with your student about budgeting and about planning, making sure that they are registered for winter classes. This just has a few of the dates that are required. So November 10th, which was yesterday, is when backpack opens. So students can start choosing their courses and putting them in what we call their backpack. November 17th, continuing graduate students can register. Then November 20th to December 5th is undergraduate students. And then on January 7th, classes begin. And on January 20th is the drop add deadline. So that would be dropping a course with a full tuition refund, less the expenses. So these are just important dates to remember if you're talking with your student about how many credits they're going to take or what classes they're going to take. A full load is considered 12 credits for a full-time student. And of course, we are going to have time for questions with your speakers. I wanted to note two things. In the interest of time, again, we will not be able to answer all questions. We have over 1,000 family members registered for this webinar, which is fantastic, but we are a little bit limited on time, so we probably won't get to everyone's questions tonight. We will answer them and send them out via email with a copy of these slides. And again, I mentioned that you can view all of the MFamily Conversation recordings on our YouTube website. The address is listed at the bottom of this slide, and it's at mfamily-um if you go to YouTube. You can watch all of these webinars that have happened for the last few years. So if you have any questions or there was a particular spot that you wanted to review, we will post that within the coming week. All right, and I am going to turn it over to Nicole and Emma. Emma has been dutifully compiling all of your questions so that we can ask them of the appropriate staff member, and we will go to those now.
Emma's been doing a great job, and I want to shout out to all the families that started, the participants that started this session, putting their questions in. So some information may be repeated if families or participants entered their question before the speaker for that topic had an opportunity to speak. I'd be happy to read the questions that we've been kind of gathering. There's a lot of overlap from some of the questions, so we've grouped them. Emma, do you think that's okay if I just jump in and start shouting out some questions? Okay. So the first question I'll put out there is for Michigan Housing. So I'll ask Dr. Zabriskie. There's a couple of questions about becoming an RA. The people are interested to know how students go about applying, whether or not it is very competitive, and basically when students might know if they're selected as they're considering their plans for the next year.
Sure. Well, the application process or the application deadline is already passed. It is a competitive process. And I know that the housing team is engaged in interviews now. I'm not sure what the timeline is for letting the successful applicants know about what will be available, but it should be before the beginning of next semester. I believe. I will double check that while I'm offline and make sure that we get a response to that.
Thank you so much. And because we have a practice of sharing the Q&A document with participants, if you get more information, want to add it to this document, it'll go out to everyone after the session in a couple days. So thank you for what you can find tonight and for the future. Before I let you go, though, Michael, the second question that was very, very common, I think entered at least 6 times. People are very interested in better understanding continuing students who may live in housing now and be interested in housing for the future. And you talked about the fact that a percentage each year may live on campus. But let me tell you the nature of the questions out here right now. Someone is asking, they're looking for whether or not you can quantify it, ballpark a percentage or a number of sophomores, which for us may just look like continuing students, but for sophomores in particular.
I'm not sure I can quantify it, and let me say why.
Yep.
Part of the challenge is not only the number of students that choose to return, but what the demand is for the spaces we have available. So I should say that we do not provide a seniority system for older students to go first. Okay, so sophomores, juniors, seniors, whoever currently lives in the residence halls will be given the same sort of opportunity, or the same random opportunity to be placed in a specific order to select spaces. But we do expect that, like I said before, about approximately 25% of our housing stock, which is our the number of beds that we have in our system right now is approximately 10,000. We'll have more starting next year. So, like I said, it's less about the number of students, but more about what the demand is for the spaces we have available.
Thank you so much for that. And when I come back around, since you mentioned having more next year, there are several questions to help people better understand the Central Campus residential complex and what that increased capacity will mean. But I'll come back if time permits. I want to move over to Mark Simmons from Beyond the Diag. I think that there were several questions from people looking to understand the support from Beyond the Diag for properties that are listed in the off-campus services or resources that are available. And so one of the questions is whether or not, and I've got a couple for you, but I'll start off with whether or not being listed in Beyond the Diag as a property, does that mean that the university has vetted the landlord or the property?
Thanks, Nicole. So we, all of the housing providers listed on the off-campus housing search website are asked to ensure that they are compliant with all relevant Michigan housing laws, all relevant Ann Arbor ordinances and housing laws. They're asked to ensure that they are up to date on their code compliance regarding safety and so forth. The university doesn't have an independent inspection or property verification team. That is left to the responsibility of the city of Ann Arbor. It's their ordinance. The university doesn't have legally binding ordinances that require landlords to maintain their property. And so it's the city of Ann Arbor that holds responsibility for property inspections, ensuring that properties are up to code and so forth. And it's also the city of Ann Arbor that is responsible for responding to complaints or concerns about the status of a property, the behavior of a landlord, anything that a tenant or a potential tenant might experience during a lease signing process. Those are all issues and concerns that can be directed towards the city of Ann Arbor. And dare I say, the city of Ann Arbor wants to be responsive to. So the more concerns they receive, the more that they can identify and respond to those types of issues.
Thank you very much. The second area where there are quite a few questions for Beyond the Diag has to do with leasing in general, but people are looking for more information to address the perception that students can or cannot sign leases, but the question is, can students sign leases? So if you can talk a little bit about that. But there's another part of it in terms of any legal elements that prevent students from signing a lease prior to January. And if you can clarify that. I know those are not the same question, but I want to put them both out there for you to think about.
Yes. And I think the first question was asking for clarity on whether, and I want to make sure I have this right, Nicole, whether students can sign leases at all.
Period. Can they sign leases?
So in almost all cases, I appreciate that occasionally at the University of Michigan, there may be exceptions to this, but in almost all cases, the students who are living off campus and looking to move off campus are legally adults. They're over the age of 18. There's normally an assumption that they are therefore legally permitted to sign a legal contract. We recognize that there's a lot of nuance that goes into that, and we recognize that signing a legal contract is a big deal, and signing this kind of lease may be the first time that many of these students have signed a contract like that. And that's one of the reasons why we really encourage students to take their time to get their lease reviewed with Student Legal Services, to go over it with a friend or another trusted adult that can give them some advice and perspective, because we recognize it's a big deal. But yes, the short answer is in most cases, a student can sign a lease. Where it comes to, there may be some financial obligations. Some landlords may ask for a co-signer or a guarantor or a certain amount of money paid up front. And that can vary depending on the landlord, depending on a housing provider. But where it comes to the legal document of the lease itself, in most cases, the student can sign that. The timing of when they're permitted to sign a lease, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds, but the city of Ann Arbor passed a number of ordinances in recent years that relate to when a property can be both promoted and advertised and shown to would-be tenants, and then when leases can actually be signed. It gets very technical very quickly, but the idea from the city of Ann Arbor is to try and minimize the number of leases that are being signed almost as soon as someone's moved into a property. So let's say a student moves into a property in August. What we used to see years ago was those same students in October, even in September, being asked by that landlord, hey, are you going to sign a lease next year? Do you want to live here next year? Sign a lease now, when they've literally just moved in. And putting them under a great deal of pressure to decide what their housing plans are 11 months into the future. So the ordinances that the city have passed are designed to really slow that process down and mean that leases are not being signed until February or March. It gets technical depending on exactly when the lease finishes, and it's like 180 days from the end of the lease. But in most cases, that normally means a kind of late winter, early spring kind of time frame. There are different steps that some housing providers take to gather interest, and that may be that they operate wait lists, and it may be that they suggest that you make certain kinds of financial commitments that may not technically be signing a lease, but it may be asking you to do things that make a commitment. In all of those cases, I would strongly encourage you to connect with Student Legal Services and make sure that you understand what it is you're committing to, both financially and also any kind of contract, or you're signing something, etc. And if you have a concern that you believe a landlord may be doing something that you're not quite sure is in line with a city ordinance, again, I'd really encourage you to refer that back to the city. Because if there is a landlord who's operating out of compliance, the city would like to know about that.
Thank you so much, Mark. When I circle back around, we have some other questions that I'll bring your way, but thank you very much. Now I want to move on to Dr. Martin. Travis, if we can talk about some of the questions that are here regarding joining. I believe the questions are really about Panhellenic sororities with regard to chapter facilities. So can you say a little more? And again, some of these questions came before you all spoke, but can you say a little bit more about how easy it is or is not for sophomores to get to live in their sorority facility? And will they know this? Will there be space given they don't rush? Oh, recognizing that primary recruitment for Panhellenic and attracting a lot of first-year students happens in the winter semester. But can you talk about whether or not they will know if there's room? And then for people who seek to join a sorority as a sophomore, a Panhellenic sorority as a sophomore, what is it like for them to be interested in living in the chapter facilities?
Yeah, it was a really good question. Thanks, Nicole. So I'll start by saying there's a great deal of variability in terms of the likelihood of a sophomore, meaning assuming that, when you're saying sophomore, I want to make sure I'm maybe clarifying that So usually a student would join their fraternity, their sorority, in this case, a sorority, Penland sorority, their freshman year, their first year. And as a sophomore, they move into the facility typically. And so their first year of membership, most of the houses have a capacity between, to give you, put some numbers to it, maybe about 40 to maybe 70. So that's a range of what maybe the capacity of sorority houses are. Well, new member classes, on average, tends to be, last year was 70. I think the average new member class was about 70, 80 members, right? And so there were some houses that had maybe 40 bed spaces or 50 bed spaces, and they may have requirements that maybe certain officers live in, which then knocks that number down to, let's say, 35. And so you're talking about taking a new member class of somewhere between 60 to 80 individuals, and then trying to prioritize who is going to be living in and who's not, right? So, but that process tended to take place about 2 to 3 weeks following the primary recruitment period. So this year, primary recruitment will happen in January. So I would suggest probably by the end of January, students will know whether they'll be living in their sorority house the upcoming fall. Now, for sophomores joining a sorority or fraternity, that tends to not necessarily change the the odds of being living in the house, right? Typically, they look at housing as a first year member, right? So if you're a first year member in your organization, whether you're joining as a freshman or joining as a sophomore, most groups will say your first year membership. We have a criteria by which we decide any first year members how they get allocated housing space in the group. So, but I hope that answered your question. But it's a really good question. But it does vary
Thanks.
based on the size of the group and what their criteria are.
Thank you so much. So what I heard you saying for everyone is that not every chapter that will offer a student membership necessarily has the capacity to house that student for the next year. So the student should be talking and learning about that in the recruitment process because it's not a given. And the other thing I think I heard you said for people who join the sororities during their second year at Michigan. So the sophomore standing is one thing, but it's their second year or so at Michigan. It's also not guaranteed that they would have access to live in a chapter facility for the future year, for the next year. Did I
Yeah,
get
that is
that part?
correct. Yeah, that is correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, and much like what Michael said around housing, none of the sororities will give priority in terms of ranking members. They tend to prioritize their first year, so it's actually the opposite. They prioritize first year members joining. So.
And the students get a great education through your area and the work of the council leaders in understanding the value of being a part of the organizations for a long time, not just for sophomore year housing. So there's so much more to offer. And yes, it's a vibrant community. The second question for FSL has to do with the student joining a chapter that currently does not have a chapter facility. The example provided would be an IFC fraternity. But the question is about what to think about when the student would be joining an organization that doesn't have housing right now. Any advice?
Yeah, yeah. So, I think if your student has joined a fraternity or any organization that does not have a housing component, I think as early as students are thinking about where they're going to live next year now, you don't necessarily have to worry about that obligation, right? To have obligations to support a facility or housing or living in a property. So, but what most of those organizations do is they tend to partner with individuals that are in the organization, and they find properties, i.e., like through the Beyond the Diag process or any other off-campus property, and they tend to just live together. Not necessarily as an entire membership, but groups of them might live together somewhere off campus. And again, I'm sure Beyond the Diag program could be a great resource for those individuals. And we encourage students to, if they haven't, attend the housing fairs, figure out where they might want to join. But they are they just don't have the opportunity to have an organization that is coordinating that housing for them, and they would have to do that on their own. So, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take a minute and answer the questions that I can answer, and then I'll come back through Michigan Housing Beyond the Diag and Fraternity and Sorority Life. A number of people were asking, again, probably before it was said in the session, whether or not students can receive financial aid or support to cover their off-campus rent and other living expenses. And the answer is generally yes, whatever the student is entitled to help pay for their education-related expenses for the year. A portion will remain with the university for tuition and fees, and any over amount would be distributed to the student in something we call a financial aid refund each semester, and the student should use those funds to cover their living expenses. So families and supporters will have a lot of practice with students learning to manage a budget and making sure that they are able to take those funds and apply them in a multi-month scenario if they would need to. The other easy question for me to answer tonight is people were asking whether or not the slides and the links will be available after this session. Yes, the recording of this session will be shared out to every registrant by email, and a list of the questions with answers and some of the links will also be included. So you'll have access to those things at that time. The last question that I think I can answer for everyone, but I'll ask my colleagues here to correct me if I'm wrong. Students who live off campus can purchase dining plans. So the answer to that is yes. It was a question whether or not a student living off campus can still eat in the dining halls. And yes, they can. So this next question is open to each of our speakers tonight to share ideas or insights. But for a student who will have study abroad as part of their year next year, who primarily needs housing for fall but not winter, what do you recommend for them as they're planning this year for that period?
Why don't I start and then I can let Mark and Travis chime in. So, if a student goes on a university approved or sanctioned abroad program and the student resides in Michigan housing, they'll be permitted to exit their contract without penalty to go to that program. If your student is considering that, that likely is going to be the cleanest option in terms of um, being able to exit and know that they'll be able to exit their housing obligation without penalty. But I will defer to Mark and Travis for other elements of that.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So for students who are living off campus, and we know for many students, if you are a returning student, you may be living off campus. We are expecting to see an increased number of returning students who will be on campus, as Michael was sharing about earlier on, and that exciting opportunity. But we still know that many students will be living off campus and taking those opportunities for semesters abroad, for internships that may place them elsewhere than Ann Arbor, and then the myriad other reasons why a student may be not returning to Ann Arbor for a portion of the year. So we have a part of our website, and if you navigate to our housing search website, and I'm actually going to very briefly share my screen if that's possible, just to show you that part of the website. And it is so this is what our off-campus housing search website looks like. And you see this disclaimer. You can see in the yellow bar along the top that there are different labels, different tabs. This subleases tab is the one that I want to draw attention to specifically, because this is where students can both list their property and they can also search if they want to see properties that might be listed on there. So you can see there's this map view right here on the right side, and then you can scroll down and you can see lots of properties that are being listed on here. At this time of year, you're really starting to see a lot of properties that are being listed for December or January availability. And I've just scrolled through, I haven't kind of vetted these or looked at these. This is purely what's on the site right this moment. But you can see it's a real mix of different kinds of housing, different options, different budget requirements, everything from $2,000 a month, which is a lot of money, to $800 a month, which is more affordable, and everything in between. So definitely encourage you to spend some time on there. If you are looking for a sublease because you're arriving in Ann Arbor at some point during the year and you don't want to sign a 12-month lease, or you know that you are going to be leaving at some point, then take a look at the subleases. And equally, if you are leaving Ann Arbor, if you're planning to do a study abroad and you want to promote your unit, your bed space, then you can create an ad that gets listed on there. And that is always where we encourage students to look when they're looking for that kind of partial year option.
Yeah. And what I'll say about fraternities and sororities is one of the great benefits of joining a fraternity and sorority and having the option to live on is many of those organizations work very closely with the university and are very accommodating to students studying abroad. And so that process will look different in terms of how you notify the organization that you're going to be studying abroad, and the process by which you may be asked to contribute to the either subleasing of a space, or maybe continuing to pay dues, or what dues might look like. As you all know, a sorority or fraternity require membership dues as a part of being a member, and your membership, although you may be studying abroad, won't necessarily pause then, so you still may have some obligations depending on the organizations to contribute financially to the organization. But at least the housing and board, room and board options, many of the organizations do make those accommodations for a member to not have to pay for rent or room and board as they are studying abroad. And so, and that process will look different depending on organization in terms of how you make that known to the house corporation or the local alumni who are managing the properties.
I want to thank you all so much for answering questions tonight and for your presentations and your remarks overall. We are almost at time, so I'm going to quickly transition it back over to Rachel. I did not get to answer the question about the registration dates again, but of course, I know Rachel can talk about how you can receive all of this information and more. So I'll turn it back over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Nicole. So there are a lot of questions. As I mentioned, we had over 1,000 registrants for this webinar tonight, and we've got hundreds of questions. I promise that we will get those questions and answers out to you within the next week, along with the slides. And again, you can find our recorded video on the YouTube channel. One thing that I did want to mention before we conclude that I saw a couple of questions about is leasing. There were questions about leasing through Beyond the Diag. I just wanted to be clear that the Beyond the Diag program doesn't actually lease off-campus housing. They support students who live off campus. And so students would sign a lease with an independently owned apartment building, house, co-op, things like that. But that the Beyond the Diags program would support students who do sign those leases with those parties off campus. Again, we will send out all of the questions and answers. If you have questions in the meantime that you may want to look into tonight, if you Google almost any word and UMich or UMICH, you will find that. You will find that our resources come up right away. So if you Google Beyond the Diag and UMich, or off-campus housing and UMich, or UMich housing, it will take you right to the websites that you're looking for, and there is a wealth of information there as well. I thank you all for joining. We are officially at time, and really appreciate you all joining us to listen tonight, and to all of our presenters for presenting, and we wish you the very best. Thank you so much.